Welcome to Decarbonizing Commerce, where we explore what's new, interesting, and actionable at the intersection of climate innovation and commerce. I'm your host, Keith Anderson, and together we'll meet entrepreneurs and innovators reinventing retail, e-commerce, and consumer products through the lenses of low carbon and commercial viability. I'm Keith Anderson. This is the Decarbonizing Commerce podcast, and my guest today is Jaxie Friedman, Sustainability Manager for Atomo Coffee, which is a producer of both beanless and hybrid, some bean, some no bean coffee, which is one of the most interesting categories that I think is exposed to climate as a business impact, and their approach to it is really worth being aware of and studying. And so I'll tell you a bit about why, and then we'll meet Jaxie. Firstly, coffee is one of these categories that is not among the highest emission categories you'll find in the supermarket, but it is, not at the low end. And so on the mitigation side of things, that is, what can we do? What do we need to do to lower the emissions profile at a category level? Coffee and cocoa are categories that are pretty interesting to look at. On the flip side, though, as you've heard in other conversations, in the case of olive oil as one example, it's one of the categories that is exposed to some of the disruption and risk of more extreme weather and higher temperatures. And so, starting with targeting coffee as a category to go innovate in, and innovating through a lens of both, producing a product that people want to drink and choose to drink, that also has a lower environmental footprint and is less exposed to the disruption of more extreme weather, is a pretty interesting case study. And Jaxie has played a big role in a lot of the decisions that the company has made from a sustainability perspective. She's got a really deep understanding of everything that I've sort of set up here. And I really enjoyed meeting and speaking with her, and I think you will too. So let's meet Jaxie Friedman of Atomo Coffee. Jaxie, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us for the Decarbonizing Commerce podcast.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I think for those that maybe are less familiar with Atomo, maybe we could start with just, in your words, what is Atomo and what do you do?
Yeah. So Atomo is all about redefining the coffee landscape with beanless coffee. We make coffee that's crafted out of high quality superfoods and upcycled ingredients to make coffee something that tastes just like coffee, but without any green coffee beans. That's why we call ourselves Beanless Coffee. And a little bit more about me and what I do at Atomo. So I'm our sustainability manager here. So a big part of why Atomo exists is that coffee supply chains are threatened by climate change. And coffee has a massive environmental footprint. It's one of the kind of plant-based commodities that is most directly tied to deforestation and other major things that are influencing changing climate and all of the negative effects that come with that. So sustainability is kind of really core to why Atomo exists. And so as a sustainability manager here, I help us to kind of quantify our impact and think about how we can incorporate sustainability into different components of our business. We just recently released our environmental footprint of our espresso grounds. And when you compare beanless coffee to conventional coffee, our espresso grounds uses 70% less farmland, which means more forest and grasslands that are able to be preserved, and that we cause 83% fewer carbon emissions. So I'm really excited that we've been able to kind of put some proof out there that our beanless coffee does some good stuff for the planet.
Well, I mean, those are some just incredible data points. Maybe we can talk for a minute about how you arrive at those kinds of estimates. You know, I know that there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of variables, and there are some standards, but not everything is standardized. So how do you arrive at those kinds of estimates?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we did the calculations in partnership with a company called How Good. They provide a data platform that allows folks to calculate their environmental impact in a variety of different areas. And we've really focused on kind of the carbon component of it. And How Good works with a lot of the globally established methodologies that allow you to kind of analyze the footprint of a product from the raw materials through to end of life. So it's called a product environmental footprint, but it's similar to what you'd think of as a life cycle analysis. In that it's analyzing the footprint of various different components of the product's life cycle.
We know How Good. They're going to be providing climate labels for the meals at our summit in September.
I love that. Yeah, they're doing some incredible work, and they've been a great partner for us.
And how deep in the weeds do you personally get in understanding what drives emissions up or down, and to what extent does that then influence decisions that the company makes about future formulations and sourcing decisions, any of those sort of commercial considerations?
Yeah. So for the first part of your question, how deep in the weeds, I go pretty deep in the weeds, partially because as I mentioned, we're not using green coffee beans. We use a variety of other plant-based ingredients to create something that tastes exactly identical to coffee. But it means we have a more diverse supply chain. We use some ingredients that are readily available and others that are a little bit more niche and have less established supply chains. For ingredients that are less commonly studied, you may need to incorporate in some proxies, understanding the footprint of one commodity and using that as a reference point for another because it hasn't been studied. So I've had to go pretty deep into the weeds to make sure that, we're using appropriate proxies in terms of understanding the impact of our ingredients. And also when we're thinking about, it's not just at the ingredient level, but also from a region and kind of looking at the specifics and the comparison of, if we were to source something from India versus Kenya versus wherever, the impacts of those growing practices are going to be really different. And so we've been excited to be able to use the Lattice platform that How Good offers to be able to take that kind of next step to thinking about how it influences our product development. So because this was our first official product environmental footprint we launched with How Good, we've really been able to now use the learnings coming off of that to start to implement some practices so we can think about how it influences product development down the line. You kind of need to know your baseline to be able to make improvements for the future. And we've been using it to inform when we're thinking about if we want to source a new ingredient from a different location, are there lower impact places that make sense to get certain things? We've also been using it as a reference point for when we're considering new ingredients within our formula, not necessarily in terms of saying like it must hit this threshold to be in the formula, but thinking about, okay, which are ingredients that are hotspots in our formula and what could be some alternatives, and thinking about kind of the bigger picture of with a sort of some kind of guardrails of what the footprints could be. It allows us to kind of make more strategic decisions about, where we're able to improve our footprint and what are the levers that we can pull. Well, and happy to get into deeper parts of that if you'd like.
I would love to. And maybe we can weave into the discussion something that you also said, which was from a taste and flavor perspective, it's functionally indistinguishable from conventional beaned coffee. I'm not close enough. I don't know how I would describe it, but that's something that I think is really important and something that we hear a lot of brand manufacturers discussing more and more, which is we're trying to balance these trade-offs in essentially 4 areas from what I can see. One is sort of quality, whether that's defined as taste, nutrition, you name it. Another is emissions profile. Another is how reliably can we get it? And the final is what's it cost? So, when you said it tastes the same, it immediately had me think about what's that dynamic look like inside the company when you're getting this new data and then meeting with the product development or innovation team and thinking about, okay, well, this might lower the footprint, but then we've got to consider the cost and we've got to consider the taste and
Yeah. So I'll just say outright from like kind of the broader CPG perspective, and most of the sustainable food and beverage companies, like even the sustainability people who are kind of owning the footprint part of things, I feel like most folks are aligned that ultimately the taste is the most important thing, right? Even if a product is better for the planet, but it's not quite as good, it's just really hard to get folks to buy it and to get bought into it, right? And so there needs to be these fundamental benefits, whether it's flavor or health benefits that people are seeking out, that I think have to be of the most importance to when creating a new product, especially a product that's an alternative to something that people already know and love, right? People are really passionate about their morning coffee. It's part of their habit, their routine, and they're not going to at least most folks aren't going to just, swap it out for a cup of tea or, some other alternative. And so I think with that in mind, we always discuss internally that like the flavor has to be right. And so that I would say is the most important thing. And I think that we've been really successful with because I think our products taste really good. But with that in mind, I think, as we're looking at new product development and also as we're looking at scaling, I think all of those things that you just mentioned are important, right? We have to think about what is our price going to be on shelf? How does it affect our footprint and how does that connect to kind of the sustainability story that is core to our brand? I think all of these things do kind of come into play. It's not necessarily my scope of work that is kind of owning that decision-making framework, but I'd say all 4 of those components do come to the table when we're looking at the launch of a product. I'd say the kind of root of our ideation is coming from that, like, let's nail down a great tasting product. It needs to taste good, have the right mouthfeel, all of these things. I'd say like that is the driver of our innovation. And then because we have a really passionate team that cares about environmental components, we weave it in at any stage of the process that we can so that as we're identifying flavor notes that are really good that we want in our product, we can think about how those individual components can be a little bit better, a slightly lower footprint.
Makes a ton of sense. And you had mentioned you could go even deeper on some of the footprint analysis. You mentioned the location that you're sourcing from is one variable. What are some of the other factors?
We are really, I think this is really important among a lot of different kind of natural products. There's certain things that I think are foundational criteria if you want to be in certain retail spaces. Being non-GMO among many kind of natural food products is important. We like to source organic ingredients when we can, but it's not one of our kind of leading criteria. I think there's some other components. I think the jury is up in terms of, for instance, organic. We kind of were taking a look at one of our ingredients that is organic certified compared to normal ones. And we were like, why doesn't the footprint change that much? And what's interesting is certain things that we would expect to be better from a carbon footprint standpoint aren't always, right? Because with an organic product, you may have slight decreases in yield, even if there's lower input of carbon fertilizers or whatever it is. Yeah. So there's some interesting nuance there that I've been exploring as I kind of dig into specific ingredients. For us, I'd say one of the leading drivers around sustainability with our sourcing is upcycling. So our foundational ingredient is date pits, which we rescue from farmers' waste streams in the Coachella Valley in California. And food waste is just a huge problem in our country, and it leads to a much larger footprint because agriculture has tremendous ripples on our ecosystems. It has a huge carbon footprint, and we grow a lot of stuff that just ends up in the trash, right? And it's really unfortunate. And so by being a product that is certified upcycled, with the date pits being that core upcycled ingredient, we also see that being a huge lever in terms of understanding how we are doing good for the planet, because it is improving, it is reducing the methane emissions that may come from some of those pits ending up in landfill, but it's also creating a new commodity out of something that wouldn't have been used in the past. So you have the avoided emissions, and then you also have this new opportunity where if you're using less coffee that has a higher footprint, and then you're also rescuing this waste stream to make that same cup of coffee, there's kind of dual benefit there. And I'd say in terms of upcycling, our core ingredient, the date pits, is upcycled, but we're also looking to incorporate in as many upcycled ingredients into new formulations as possible. So I think that's definitely something that is kind of core to our sourcing priorities. And we're continuing to develop our coffee to use more and more of those types of ingredients.
Yeah, I see upcycling as a industry, it's been a trend for a while, but it's actually really interesting to see how it's formalizing with the certification and associations, and it's becoming a more prominent feature of a lot of brands and how they're coming to market.
Yeah, the Upcycled Food Association has done some amazing work with kind of rallying folks together around, I think, this kind of overarching concept. And I think what's been really exciting is to see the ripples coming out of that. So the upcycled certification, the number of companies that are getting that certification, which is basically like a proof of that your product has a certain quantity of the waste of diverted waste streams going into that product. The number of companies getting that certification is growing. I think we also see, there's been ripples in terms of food waste policy. The EPA's food waste hierarchy now has upcycling as one of the kind of better ways in which you can mitigate food waste, which wasn't there before. So it's been really exciting to kind of be in the upcycled world while this momentum is building.
To take a bit of a step back, and I probably should have asked this question earlier in the conversation, but I think you've done a great job unpacking some of the ways that Atomo itself is producing products that are good for the planet. Maybe it would be helpful to listeners to spend a couple minutes just talking about the coffee business itself. I mean, you mentioned, clearing forests or using farmland are a couple of the environmental impacts that the conventional approach to producing coffee has, but I think it would be interesting just to highlight why this is a category that was interesting to build a brand and a business like this in.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm happy to dig in deeper there. So coffee, I'll say kind of the foundational thing around it is that the coffee market is growing. And simultaneously, the amount of land that is suitable to grow coffee is shifting and shrinking due to climate change. So I'd say there's this broader issue where by 2050, 50% of the land currently suitable to grow coffee will be able to grow coffee. And so then there's these ripples of issues for coffee supply chains where the growing locations are going to need to change, which often means that farms are going to have to move to higher altitudes. There's going to, in association with those increased altitudes, there also happens to be a lot more forests in those landscapes, which means there's likely to be a lot more deforestation. And so that's a huge issue. And coffee companies, I think, are starting to pay a little more attention to the fact that, regardless of coffee's footprint, which I can talk about in a second, just thinking about, being able to have a cup of coffee is going to be harder and harder, especially because coffee demand is increasing, right? So if we have more coffee that needs to be consumed and a shrinking space to grow it, that's a huge issue. In terms of the coffee footprint, I think the deforestation is one of the biggest drivers of coffee's footprint. When we did our calculations with How Good, we also created a benchmark competitor, which was supposed to be representing global Arabica coffee production, which include 13 of the top coffee producing countries as those source regions and their kind of estimated impact. And what we found with this conventional coffee benchmark was that 58% of those emissions were coming from some of the deforestation component. And that's a huge portion of the coffee life cycle. Of course, there's other things that are contributing to that other remaining percentage, right? That's fossil fuel usage on farms to be able to grow the green coffee beans. It's the processing to roast the coffee beans. It's the transportation to bring coffee from, different regions where it's grown, like Brazil or different parts of Africa over to the places where it's most often consumed, right? In Europe or the United States. So there's so many different components that are contributing to the high carbon footprint, but I'd say the most critical one is deforestation. And it's actually driven a lot of attention. Coffee is one of 7 commodities that recently has been looped in to a recent study that was basically looking at how these were the main drivers of agricultural deforestation, these 7 commodities. It was coffee as well as a few other products. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but cocoa, paper pulp products, beef, of course, various different things. And these commodities are the key drivers around cutting forests in places like the Amazon. And so that's a huge problem. It's also driven a lot of change. There's recent regulation in Europe. It's called the EUDR, which is around deforestation regulation and forcing certain supply chains, such as coffee, to now show traceability that their coffee is not being sourced from places tied to deforestation. There's increasing attention to companies that are setting science-based targets, for instance, to also pay attention to, they have to, if you're setting a science-based target in partnership with like the new flag, which is like a forest, land, and agricultural, might not have the acronym exactly right.
You nailed it. I have it pulled up on my screen. You got it.
Yeah. So the flag footprint is now being, it's starting to be required among companies that have a heavy agricultural footprint. And within that flag requirement is, preventing deforestation. I think it's beginning in 2025. It's like a commitment to have no deforestation in their supply chains. And this is really hard to execute because coffee is mostly grown by lots of smallholder farmers who don't have access to certain technology and ways of tracking these things. So the coffee supply chain is really complicated. And I think climate change is threatening coffee. And simultaneously, because of coffee's footprint, I think it's created additional pressure at the legislative level, which I think is exciting, but also going to be a huge challenge for coffee companies to meet, to be able to prevent the deforestation that is so tightly connected to coffee supply chains. Those are just a few of the ways that I think coffee influences supply chains, but happy to dig into some other areas too if you want, but I could go on and on about this.
No, I mean, that was exactly what I was hoping to cover there. Hey folks, this is the part of the show where we say thank you and see you soon to the general audience, plus and higher tier members of Decarbonize.co. Stay tuned for the rest of the episode. Well, I really appreciate you joining me, Jaxie. It was super interesting. Thanks so much for joining the show.
You're so welcome.
Thanks for listening. I'm Keith Anderson, the executive producer and host of Decarbonizing Commerce. Sonic Futures handles audio, music, and video production. If you enjoy the show, we'd really appreciate it if you took a moment to subscribe and leave a review or share it with a colleague. For the full episode and more member-exclusive insight and analysis, join the Decarbonizing Commerce community at decarbonize.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Decarbonizing Commerce.